You're listening to episode 157 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Ravi S. Kudesia and Christopher S. Reina join us to speak about the antecedents of mindfulness. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this can only be sustained with your generosity. Please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com, and click on Make a Donation if you value these conversations, which can't continue without your contributions. Thank you for your help and your support. We are beings in an ecosystem, a process of becoming in each moment within our environment. We're not separate from it. It influences us, and we have an impact around us. How do our motivations shape our intentions, and how are we making change in the world with mindfulness? Ravi S. Kudesia is an assistant professor of human resource management at the Fox School of Business, Temple University. His research concerns how attention, interpretation, and energy transfer across individuals as they organize into collectives, and how these collectives solve problems and make sense of their environments. Christopher Reina is an assistant professor in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship at Virginia Commonwealth University, and the founder and president of Leading Without Ego, LLC. He consults and leads trainings on mindfulness, mindful leadership, and managing the emotional space within organizations. Our guests today are Ravi Kudesia. Ravi, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you here.
Good to be here. Thanks.
And Chris Reina. Chris, thank you for being here as well.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
This is one of the great treats that I have in speaking with more than just one guest and having a couple of people to share their views on whatever it is that we're talking about. And today we're talking about a paper that listeners to the podcast will know is linked on the episode page along with an article that'll have about that. But before we go into what that topic is, I'm wondering if each of you might give us a little bit of background about yourselves. Ravi, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. I guess the mindfulness story is probably a pretty long one. And I was actually just talking with Chris about the perils of giving a very motivational anecdote about why we practice and why we believe in mindfulness. Kind of this whole, let me tell you this dramatic story about how it worked for me, and then maybe it'll work for you, and whether that's maybe a little bit salesperson-y, and what like maybe a more alternate way of talking about why this matters to us might be. So I guess to kind of cut this story short, or just to kind of signal in on like at least one aspect of what the mindfulness thing means, and I guess this also kind of relates to how Chris and I met and know each other, is that at least for a while in the organizational realm, it was kind of, mindfulness was something that organizations were doing for quite some time actually, but we hadn't really been studying. And so I guess some time ago, maybe it would be people who were starting their programs 7, 8, maybe 9 years ago, who had been practicing for some time and had been really curious about it, started going into grad school, not in the traditional way where you have an advisor who's doing mindfulness research and you kind of end up doing what your advisor's doing. But we kind of got into it just with our own personal practice, and then a little bit of a sort of bottom up, hey, this is an interesting idea. Can we start to do this? And so I was kind of one of those people, Chris is another, who were trying to really see about what mindfulness might look like, not as a health intervention or, primarily a religious practice or primarily a psychological phenomenon, but something that's more explicitly organizational. And there is something about this question of, well, gosh, what does it mean to be organizational? And I guess part of it is this thing about how people with their different interests, different viewpoints, different perspectives can become organized, meaning they're attending to the same information, they're interpreting it in similar ways that allows them to act in coordinated manners, that kind of phenomenon. What does mindfulness have to say about it? So I guess a lot of what's been motivating me in my research, aside from the personal story, is this question of, hey, is there something uniquely organizational? Or maybe a better way to think about it is, what does mindfulness look like as a form of organizing? So not just what's going on in our heads, but how do people end up working together and interacting with each other? What sort of routines do they develop? What are the collective sense-making processes that they're able to enact? These sorts of questions. And that was something that really kind of came up and through grad school and has been motivating me since. And I think that's maybe something that's a bit of a unique approach to mindfulness, whereas I think typically we tend to think about it as something that's a little bit more psychological and individual, or else it's maybe nested in some sort of broader cultural religious viewpoint. But the question of, gosh, what does it look like to think about mindfulness as a process of organizing? So that's always been sort of a higher order perspective, viewpoint, lens, framework in the back of my mind. And I guess that was kind of the neat thing about grad school, was finding professors who were interested and supportive, and now kind of being one myself is, I have an advisee. And so this clearly is becoming a more legitimate mainstream topic of interest to folks. But that lens of mindfulness and organizing has been a real central kind of guiding light in how I think about the thing. And maybe the research topics, maybe the sorts of potential that I envision for mindfulness socially, that really, really seems to be a true north for me.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And it's fascinating to hear about this additional layer and perspective around mindfulness as what sounds like a relational thing and a creative thing as well. Nice. Well, thank you very much. Chris, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your background and interest in mindfulness.
Sure. I think I've always been interested in understanding, why we are drawn to follow some people and we're not drawn to follow others. So I think if I really think back, I've had a long-standing interest in leadership. And so I was in graduate school seeking to understand leadership better and recognizing that, the best leaders tend to make people feel valued and feel a part of something. And for me, that was what I was studying in my dissertation. And I was going through some difficult times personally, as Ravi alluded to. A lot of the ways we find ourselves, engaging in mindfulness, relates to some things that are going on in the personal life. And so I think I had a lot going on. And what I realized is I was being less effective than I could be as a friend, as a family member, as a graduate student. And something clicked in me, realizing that the things that makes perhaps the best leaders are their sense of being able to work through difficult situations and still be all about managing relationships well. And so as I continued to practice mindfulness and really unlock how beneficial it was for me interpersonally, or intrapersonally rather, for myself, what it allowed me to do is also connect more with the people around me, despite some of the pain and struggles that I was having. And it really clicked to me of I could really put this together. Mindfulness could be this link, as you alluded to, Ted, this idea that mindfulness of the individual can become something that's shared and become something that other people can also feel and experience, and it can bring people together. So while we think of mindfulness as going on in the head of a particular individual, ourselves mostly, what it allows is a different level of connecting. And that's what Ravi was really alluding to with this organizing process. How do people, uh, because of their mindfulness, organize differently and come together? And mostly the work that he and I do, of course, is in the management realm with leaders and followers, and workers. But I think that's really how it came together for me with regard to finding my way into studying mindfulness. And as Ravi alluded to, I mean, we met at academic conferences, sort of were in the same sessions a few times and got to having some conversations about how do we continue to unlock what mindfulness is, and how do we help folks understand what it means to bring mindfulness to work and to the process of organizing at work.
That's great. Thank you so much. And again, another thing is showing up is your, each of you is an assistant professor at different schools of business. And one of the things that I frequently hear as a criticism of contemporary mindfulness views that are taken from a traditional context is that they're all about greed, they're all about pacifying the workers and all about these terrible things. And that's not at all what I hear ever when I speak with people who are teaching it, when I speak with people who are in the business world or corporations, or they're teaching this kind of thing. What I'm hearing is what you're sharing here is that this is relational, it is creative. It's about how this can help make people be more connected, inspiring. I've yet to hear someone say, oh, so we can make a buck on it for greed purposes. It's not there. It always stands out for me in these interviews that, nope, just not there. So thank you both for that background on each of you. And what I'd like to do now is go into a little bit more. You mentioned how you met, going to conferences and finding common interest in some of this territory. What made you decide to collaborate on this particular paper? How did that come about? Maybe Chris, we can start with you on this.
Sure. I think one challenge that we have is that we love to think about new ideas. We like to be creative. We like to think outside of the box. And one challenge that as professors we're constrained by is what we'd love to study and how we'd love to study it isn't always as feasible when it comes to getting access to data that will allow us to test those research questions in a rigorous way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we had many conversations of studies we'd like to do, and it was just a matter of getting access to organizations and having sort of that ability to really do a study the way we wanted to. And one thing we had noted, and it's normal for a new idea to be introduced to the literature, most folks have said, let's define mindfulness and let's figure out what mindfulness predicts. In other words, like mindfulness, if you're mindful, high or low, like what does that lead to you doing differently? So thinking about mindfulness as a predictor. What a lot of folks hadn't done yet, and is normal when a construct gets introduced to a literature, is to understand, well, what contributes to that construct in the first place? In this case, what leads to mindfulness? But many of the researchers hadn't really thought of that or done that because mindfulness was assumed to be something inherent to the individual, something that the individual brings to a given situation. So thus, it's less able to be diminished or added to because of the situation, because the person, him or herself, is bringing it. And so that was an assumption that I think a lot of researchers had previously. And it was also something that we hadn't really tested before. And so through various relationships at our universities, we were able to get access to some really cool data sites to test these ideas. We had got an opportunity to be involved in some training for students in which they were in the lab and they were undergoing some difficult situations that they had to think on their feet, and it was emotionally stressful. And in those situations, we saw an opportunity to understand their state of mind and capture their states of mindfulness and figure out, okay, well, the situation is changing. What about the situation constrains or creates more capacity for those folks to be mindful in the moment? And so, I think there's this push and pull of what we'd like to study and then the access we get to study it. And together that kind of combined to create the study that we're going to focus on today that we just published. And I guess I'll let Ravi take it from there if he wants to add anything.
Well, I mean, the one thing that I would add about the collaboration was this was, I don't know how many months it was, but it was the most productive period I think I've ever had in my career, which is I was in Singapore and Chris was in Richmond. And
That's
so
right.
we were effectively working nonstop, like 24 hours, because I'd be working on something, I'd go to sleep, send it to him, and then he'd be waking up. And it was just this period of ridiculous productivity where, that opportunity would pop up. And then we'd kind of take an idea that we'd been mulling over for some time. And, oh, this links perfectly with this data collection opportunity. What about this? And so it was just a lot of really creative insights. And actually, honestly, a lot of fun kind of came out of this process. And so I think there's just kind of that piece too, which is, talking to someone about how do you pick collaborators. And one of the things that this person mentioned was, all right, well, there's skill, there's writing ability, statistical analysis ability. But then, gosh, it's also super cool to collaborate with people that you actually just like as a person and get along with and see eye to eye. So I kind of recall fondly the circumstances in which this study became possible, and I think that's probably worth mentioning because, gosh, it can be really fun, and maybe good ideas come out of fun, positive interactions too. That's certainly possible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. That was a wild, fun time. Yeah, we put in a lot of hours. That's absolutely for sure.
Well, thanks for that. And what's interesting about what you're describing is it's not mindfulness as some power that people bring into situations. It's that we people are processes and part of an ecosystem that is quite dynamic. And we're influenced by the conditions we're in, including mindfulness and how that fits into it. So I'll be interested to hear more about what you found in the paper. So Ravi, maybe you can keep going and tell us a little bit about what you propose in the paper. What's the premise?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris teed it up beautifully. The idea is basically and the title is kind of a play on the famous line by John Kabat-Zinn, wherever you go, there you are. And that was the title of his book. And the gist of it sort of is that we as people and as minds kind of pop in and out of different situations, and we bring something very essential, very inherent about us to where we go, right? And so if we are bringing these repeated patterns of ways of paying attention, of interpreting the world, this aspect of who we are to these situations, then the way we are in a situation really reflects something about us. And I mean, that's intuitively true to some extent, right? If one movie isn't funny, maybe the movie's bad, but like if every movie's not funny, maybe you just don't have a great sense of humor, right? So there is something about consistency across situations means that there's something going on inherent. But it's also very much the case, and this is what we title the paper, is that wherever you go, there you become, which is that we are very much, I mean, this is true from a Buddhist perspective, certainly, and I'd say it's also true from a psychological perspective, is that we're very much processes. And the processes are part of an open system, is that we're taking in information around us. And so the sort of person that you are as a podcaster is not going to be the same way, Ted, that you are, as a friend or as a neighbor or during your day job. And so there are these aspects where, situations do have an important aspect of shaping kind of how we show up, how we manifest ourselves and our capacity. And there was this there was sort of this piece that I read, and I just remember, I mean, it's a ridiculously simple paper, but the idea just really kind of stuck with me. It's by Ed Hutchins, and the paper's called "How the Cockpit Remembers Its Speed." And it's a simple analysis, I guess, of just as you're looking at an airplane's cockpit, the simple things, the simple tasks of remembering speeds. It's not just something that's happening within people's heads. It's something that, you know, people are interfacing with dials, and they're using books, and there's social interactions. And so cognition, as we typically think about it, is something that happens between people's skulls. But his point was that it's actually a system as a whole that's remembering the speeds. It's not just in people's heads. It's in the rituals, the interactions, the routines that they use to extract out, codify information, and then jointly enact it. And so I remember just kind of reading this piece and thinking, gosh, there is really something to be said about the power of situations and systems and the material tools and technologies that we use. And it's not so easy to kind of disconnect what we normally think about as things like mind, mindfulness, cognition, information processing from the environment. And so kind of with that thought in mind, the question then becomes, well, gosh, to what extent are the systems, the situations we're in, the context that we're in, to what extent are they facilitating or enhancing our capacity for mindfulness? And so there is, I mean, I think a pretty rich philosophical background and discussion to think about how mind itself is distributed throughout the situations that we're part of. And what we wanted to maybe do a little bit is to take that sort of philosophy, not a philosophy where the mind is something that's inherently contained within the person, that resides within their skull, and then they kind of just go from situation to situation, but takes that more process and open system sort of approach to say, well, gosh, if mind is something that's constantly being in a state of becoming, it's constantly manifesting, it's constantly arising in different ways by drawing on what's around it, you know, like the pilots with the tools and the artifacts and the technologies, how is that showing up in the way that we think about mindfulness? And that was sort of the motivational premise, which is, gosh, so far we've really thought about mindfulness in two ways. One way is that it's this inherent thing, and then the other way is that, you know, it's something that's rooted in interventions. And so you take a mindfulness-based intervention, and what's really going on is the intervention's kind of turning up some sort of dial on mindfulness in your head. And our thought was maybe there's a different way of approaching it. And so this ontology of becoming was really, at a high level, the motivating premise, is that we really do become anew in situations.
And we're not separate from those situations. We are an integral part of it, and they influence us in every moment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly that. And like Chris said, gosh, it's hard to study a complex idea like that in a very pure way, but we at least wanted to make sort of the initial first dent into thinking about mindfulness on these terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a very nice layup. And Chris, I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about, with that understanding that Ravi just gave us and setting the context. In the paper, you talk about some of these kinds of influences, these interactions with the world around us. And I'm wondering if you might describe a few of those. I know there are things like motivational forces, things like that. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one thing that's important to mention is that this study included multiple sort of mini studies. So we looked at this phenomenon that Ravi just discussed in sort of a way that we started in being really broad and not really sure exactly how this worked, and we were very sort of experimental and kind of throwing out, hey, maybe it works like this, maybe it works like this, and it was nice to have and start off with that approach. And then once we found out sort of what seemed to work well and what predicted this emergence of mindfulness, we were able to sort of hone in on it on the second and third study. So by the time we were done with this package of studies in this paper, we could be relatively sure, as we can never be fully sure, of course, but we feel pretty good about these things on average are impacting sort of how mindfulness emerges across different situations and different contexts, because we studied it with undergraduate students, we studied it with nurses who are working full-time in intensive care units, and we also studied it among a community sample. So we sort of set up the study to be very much able to extrapolate the findings across a wide swath of people and the jobs that those people do.
Yeah, and just kind of building on what Chris mentioned is our hope was to kind of dig into some real underlying mechanisms, right? And so hopefully they should be manifest across these different situations and these different occupations. And the overall, I guess the baseline model would be something like this, is that we talk often about this idea of cognitive resources in terms of, what's your capacity to process information. And we know that the things that are most resource demanding are the times when we need to self-regulate. We're paying attention to one thing and we need to regulate our attention away to something else, or we have persistent negative thoughts and we're trying to inhibit them, these sorts of self-regulatory processes. And what's kind of been interesting to us is that it seems though that that mindfulness really relies on these self-regulatory processes, but we haven't really thought about them in terms of a couple factors, one of which is there's motivational aspects. So one sort of speculation that I've had for a while, and I know Chris and I have talked about this too, is what we kind of call in the paper the transfer problem, which is we do some stuff when we're meditating on the mat, and then it's supposed to affect us in real life, but we never really theorize or explain too much what that transfer process is. Yeah. Usually, the explanation is something around neural plasticity, or we're strengthening brain regions, but I don't know how that manifests in terms of, oftentimes we'll do these really short trainings and you still see effects. And so what we thought is that maybe it's not really changing brain capacity as much as it's changing the motivations to self-regulate. And so we introduced a measure and an idea around this idea of metacognitive beliefs, which is what you basically believe about your mind. So it might not be that your actual neural capacity to pay attention is stronger, but something like, do you think that attention is scarce? Do you think that your ability to pay attention is something that's going to run out over time and you have to conserve it? Well, if you sit down and meditate for 2 hours, and as it turns out, no, I really can sustain my attention and it's not fatiguing, it's actually energizing. Well, that's changing your motivational structure, this metacognitive belief structure. And then that might be a feature that's going to transfer out. Or similarly, right, the default tendency would be something like, gosh, when I experience these negative feelings, what I want to do is suppress them, run away from them, hide from them. But actually, as it turns out, just observing them, noticing them, monitoring them with a sense of openness and curiosity it's a virtuous thing to do. Or, maybe another belief would be something around, yeah, obviously the way the world appears to me is true. It's not an interpretation of mine. It's just objective fact. Versus when you meditate, maybe you see thoughts and feelings kind of pop up, and maybe that's one way to see things, but there are other ways, and I don't have to hold on to my beliefs so tightly. So one of the thoughts that we had was, gosh, maybe what we ought to be doing is thinking about what are these metacognitive beliefs that might motivate someone to engage in these self-regulatory processes that keep our attention on ongoing events and that allow us to step back from thoughts and feelings. And so that was kind of the first aspect of how mindfulness might arise, is that we have these beliefs might drive some of our cognitive resources into self-regulation. And then the sort of other thought was like, what's what might be a complementary or a different aspect to that. And then that's where the idea of also situations came into mind, because situations can also make it harder or easier to enact these self-regulatory processes that produce mindfulness. So, a simple example would be something like, is it easier to do a task just with yourself on a computer? Or what if your smartphone is sitting right next to you, right? Just the presence of that smartphone is a distractor that makes it actually harder to drive your resources to what it is that you're trying to do. And so that was kind of the thought process, which is that we could think about aspects of situations that help draw resources onto tasks and therefore make it easier to be mindful. Or we could think about aspects of situations that pose these demands and actually make it more difficult to be mindful. So the hope was basically that we can kind of introduce a theoretical model that would trace the arising of mindfulness in situations from these metacognitive beliefs we have about how our mind works, and that these might be, and if these do in fact predict mindfulness, these beliefs that people have, that seems to be an important part of answering this question of how do interventions work, because maybe they work by changing our motivational structure. So that was the first thing. Then the second thing is kind of, again, this feeling of mental fatigue seems to be really important in how people allocate their resources. So gosh, if you're feeling really fatigued, the evolutionary purpose of fatigue is to tell you to pull your resources away from self-regulation and to do things that are beneficial to you in the present moment, right? Which is why when people feel super fatigued, they're more likely to, eat junk food, right? So that was the second sort of motivational factor. And then the third were these situational features that, either draw your resources towards tasks and therefore make mindfulness more likely, or pose additional demands and make mindfulness a little bit more difficult. So kind of starting from these more stable beliefs to more long-lasting moods like mental fatigue, to more immediate situational factors like the on-task attentional pull and the off-task attentional demands. We hope at least that the theoretical model that we're introducing and then subsequently test, like Chris mentioned, might really give a nice tracing of these situational aspects of how mindfulness arises.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask about in that, the third motivational force, the situation appraisal, is how much one's perception may influence that. Because if your perception is catastrophizing, or if your perception of the situation is, this is a cakewalk, and you're Dunning-Kruger, I got this, when you maybe don't, how much of that may influence things as well. Yeah,
absolutely. So there's the philosophical answer and the statistical answer, and I can give you the statistical answer first. Is that because the way that we designed our studies, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a second, but we do something called experience sampling, which is one person taking a brief survey many, many times. And so what you're able to do is you're able to separate out a person's typical way of being. So you can take the statistical responses and you can say there's a aspect of it that is stable for a person. And then there's an aspect of, relative to that person's baseline, how much is this situation? So one of the things that we assess is called hindrance stressors. And that's like politics, red tape, busy work, the sort of negative aspects of institutions and organizations that we really hate and that stress us out. So gosh, maybe I perceive things maybe in a catastrophizing way. And so, yeah, my baseline levels will be quite high, but we can subtract out each person's average from the rest of their responses. And that gets, even if I'm somebody who thinks things are normally high, this is high even for me, or this is low relative to my baseline. So the statistical answer is that, yeah, we're able to account for both those, and actually looking at the differences at what we would call the between person differences, which are your average tendencies, and then the within person fluctuations, which is relative to your own baseline, is this high or low. Those differences in what seems to exert effects versus not are quite telling, actually. They're really of interest. And so I think you're absolutely right, is that there are aspects of how people appraise things, and maybe two people would praise the same thing quite differently. But what's quite lovely about, the method, at least, is that we can really distinguish between the two and see cases where sometimes they don't work the same way or in the same direction or the same magnitude of effect size. And that's kind of neat to notice.
Yeah, what I like about what you're saying, Ravi, and maybe Chris, you can say a little bit more about this, is one of the criticisms that often comes up in studies around mindfulness is that it's small sample sizes and it's all self-report, and that's used as an excuse to completely dismiss it. And yet, what you're describing is something where it's taking into account what that individual variability might be. And you didn't have a tiny, tiny, small sample size. You had hundreds of people in this. Chris, I'm wondering if you could fill us in a little bit more about that.
Sure, it's a really good point, and Ravi did a great job kind of explaining the differences between that between and within person. I mean, I think if we think about where and how mindfulness operates, it inherently operates moment to moment, right? It's by definition a state of being, and yet as a sort of shortcut and as a necessity to do research, much of the research on mindfulness has really captured mindfulness according to it being a trait or sort of an average level of a person's uh, way of approaching life with mindfulness or not. And so that is limited because as we said, mindfulness is inherently a state of being. So capturing it at one point in time and assuming that's how it always is, of course, ignores all the variation that someone has across a given day. Plus, of course, whether and when they took that initial measurement of mindfulness, depending on how mindful or not they were at that moment, becomes their sort of average level that predicts the rest of the variables in a given study. And so one thing that Ravi and I very much are passionate about is measuring mindfulness, how it occurs, which is moment to moment. Now, of course, there's always trade-offs in research for being extra rigorous, and Ravi and I always ask for the moon and are very satisfied when people don't give us the moon, but give us a lot of opportunity to collect data. And what we mean by that is, instead of capturing mindfulness once, our default is to ideally capture mindfulness 3 times a day from each participant, and ideally over 2 weeks. And so if you think about it, 3 times a day times 5 work days, that's 15. And then times 2 weeks. So we have 30 data points per person. And so instead of a sample size or an N of being 100, like perhaps a typical study, we really have 100 times 30 or 3,000. And so really our effective sample size is much larger at that within person level that Ravi talked about. And Ted, as you alluded to, right? I mean, that makes it much more rigorous and powerful to look at how mindfulness fluctuates moment to moment. Instead of then saying, a person's level of mindfulness at one point in time predicts their engagement at a different point in time, we can say across 30 instances, when their mindfulness tends to be higher than average, does their engagement also tend to be higher on average? And so we can really start to say, I mean, never moving completely toward causality, of course, but starting to say with more or with less hesitation that, it's mindfulness likely driving a huge part of, whatever we're studying. So that was more about just the methodology in general, but I think it is absolutely a benefit to our study and one that we hope researchers and practitioners alike start to continue and embrace more, because that's mindfulness where it happens, is in that day-to-day and moment-to-moment fluctuation.
Yeah. So Chris, I'm wondering if we could stay with you for a little bit on this. I'm curious about, you had mentioned we're not to the point of causation. Of course, correlation is not causation. And what were some of the things that you did find? What were some of those attributes that may have been present when mindfulness was in some way there as well, or not? What did that look like when you had the results?
Yeah, absolutely. As Ravi discussed, the metacognitive beliefs ended up being very powerful predictors ultimately of how one's mindfulness fluctuates moment to moment. As he alluded to, that idea of how you believe and how you think about your mind working absolutely has a big part in actually informing how the mind ends up working. So that was a huge part of the study. It ended up being a big part of the study that we actually removed some of it from the manuscript just because it was so long, but that was one of the major contributions, was fleshing out what is this idea of metacognitive belief and how do we measure it. So a lot of work went into that, and I don't know if I can't remember. I don't think Ravi mentioned the three components by name, but he did talk about the different aspects of metacognitive beliefs. But just to recap them briefly, this idea that that you can and are able to pay attention and stay attentive for periods of time, long periods of time, without getting fatigued. So that was like one of the areas of beliefs. And the second one is that it is valuable and important for one to be able to step back and just notice the feelings as they arise, whether that's something that you should do or not. That would be that second component. And then the third component for metacognitive beliefs are really all about thinking and acknowledging whether there are alternative ways to account for something that happened, right? So interpreting an event in a different way other than our default, or at least acknowledging that there are alternative ways to interpret an event. So those together in that package kind of create this idea of metacognitive beliefs. And then sort of going beyond the metacognitive beliefs to what you asked, Ted, about the situational aspects. And we found, so these are different findings slightly on the different studies, but sort of the general trends, positive social interactions. So when we interact with others in the workplace and we feel that we trust them and the interaction is positive, that was helpful for creating mindfulness and bringing out mindfulness. The extent to which we feel that there is a nice balance between the resources we as individuals bring to the situation and then what the situation calls for from us, right? Otherwise known as like this flow state. Flow is created when what you have to bring matches what the situation needs, and that puts us in a state of flow. So flow, when that happened, right, that was helpful for creating more mindfulness. And then on the flip side, Ravi mentioned those hindrance stressors, those things that annoy us and stress us out. Maybe it's the politics of an organization or the bureaucracy that one has to navigate, the necessary parts of the job, but still they're very depleting. And we found across the studies, the extent to which individuals experience those hindrance stressors in large amounts very much like deplete and bring us away from higher levels of mindfulness. And then we only studied this in one of the studies, but it's interesting, and it's something that Ravi and I very much want to study in other studies, this idea of technology use, especially as we are more and more connected to our smart devices. It becomes more and more difficult to put them down. And yet, Ravi and I are both professors in the classroom, and we have this constant thought of like, do we allow students to use their computers, right? It's a great note-taking tool, but there's also the likelihood that there's distractions. And so we sort of broke up technology into two different categories. And I think the findings make a lot of sense, but I still think it's instructive to think about the two different components of this technology. And one was, are you passively scrolling through social media, right? And is it something you just go to because you're bored or you have time in between events, right? So we found that was damaging to levels of mindfulness, as you might expect, versus using technology to look up something like a Wikipedia or to seek information, right? That helped bring us toward mindfulness. So there's a little bit of nuance there of how the technology played out.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you describe that, because as you both may know, I teach mindfulness live and online. And one of the things I start with in orientations is, because the people are joining on their computers typically, is that you have before you one of the most devious distraction devices ever invented, and ask you to do one thing: please take your hands and put them in your lap, off the mouse, off the keyboard. And once, when delivering that message in a program in the corporate world to colleagues in IT, folks that I knew, I heard at that moment groans and laughter on the other line, because that was such a challenge, because so much of our identification in that context, in that world, is how much can I multitask? And of course, we know that's not how the human brain works. Processors can do that, computers can do that, but people don't multitask. And so it's just distraction at that point. So I'm interested in hearing more about, so you describe things like these things that are also there when mindfulness is present, like flow states, or feeling like you're well connected and supported by a good team, that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you looked at ways to determine which was the cause and which was the effect, or were only able to identify these were conditions that were present at the time.
Do you want to take that one, Ravi?
Yeah, sure. Give me the hard ones. Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, so the first study, like Chris mentioned, we should really be grateful to the reviewers and the editors too, is that they were really on board with this. Is that I mean, there's problems going on in behavioral science where kind of people take exploratory approaches and then present them as being confirmatory, and that leads to some sort of issues around, is work going to replicate? But the editor and reviewers were really on board with, hey, this is our first study, and we just sort of explored a bunch of potential things that we think might influence mindfulness, and we tested them all at the same time, and that increases our power to detect findings. But here's some corrections for p-values and all that. But we'd like to kind of, if you think this is a valuable idea, we'd like to pursue it a little further, and then treat this really as an exploratory study and be a little bit more confirmatory in study 2 and 3. And yeah, they were absolutely on board with that. And so, kind of in the subsequent studies, we would do, I mean, a lot of the typical things that you would do, which would be, sort of lag time between predictors and outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, Chris mentioned the metacognitive beliefs, right? And so, gosh, with these nurses that were working these 12-hour shifts, mm-hmm. and we'd find that, these beliefs that were reported prior to a work shift would predict state mindfulness 12 hours later after their shift had ended. Or similarly in study 3, for people who are the community sample of, full-time working employees, is again reporting, these things reported before work predict mindfulness after work. So getting that temporal separation was really interesting. Mm-hmm. Another thing that's kind of neat, and this kind of harkens back to what you had mentioned before about the within versus between person levels. So for instance, some of these effects really only held at one or the other. So for instance, Chris had mentioned positive social interaction. So do I like the people I'm interacting with? Do I trust them? And you can imagine that at both levels. The within-person level would be, hey, I just had a positive social interaction. What does this do for my mindfulness, a little bit later, an hour later, right? Or that's like a one-time interaction, sort of a positive priming sort of thing. But you could also imagine it as, what happens if most of the people that I interact with I like, right? So one's a context effect, one's a sort of a one-time, one-off social interaction effect. And so what we find is actually there is no one-time social interaction effect. So it's not like I can just be nice to you, Ted, and then that's going to increase your mindfulness. But it is the case that, gosh, if you're in a context where you do like and you trust and you feel good around the people that you interact with, that does seem to be associated with positive mindfulness. So kind of some of these effects and the disentangling was interesting. And this is actually, we're not talking about this particular study, but we had, Chris and I had previously published a study looking specifically at whether you find people trustworthy. And it's the exact same finding, which is that if I interact with one person that I find to be trustworthy, particularly trustworthy, it doesn't have much effect on my mindfulness. But if I'm in a context of trust, where I find most of the people I interact with typically are trustworthy, that does seem to be related to higher levels of mindfulness. So I think that's kind of another interesting way to maybe disentangle a little bit, is finding that some of these effects work in different ways. And that could be contrasted, for instance, Chris mentioned the skill challenge balance, right? So as he had mentioned, that's the key antecedent to flow. So we weren't saying whether the flow state and the mindfulness state tend to overlap. What we were kind of asking is, what about the major antecedent to flow, which is when the task that you're working on requires just the amount of challenge that your skill level has. And as it turns out, one task does seem to have that sort of effect. So there is a within person one-off effect for that. So gosh, when that task bubbles up and it's something that is really kind of challenging you, engaging you, it draws your attentional resources towards the task and makes it more easy to be mindful. And so that's kind of another way to think about it, is not just lagging between predictors and outcomes, but also thinking about the differences between these one-off versus more stable contextual ways of thinking about things. And one of the neat consequences too is that this has, and I think this is maybe unique to management journals, but they usually want a section called practical implications or managerial implications. And all right, so you're in a business school, you're supposed to be thinking about organizations and organizing. So gosh, how on earth does this have an implication for a manager, as if managers were reading OBHTP or any of our journals? But if they were, what would they get out of it? And well, yeah, this actually has something to say about how we can design our systems to be more facilitative of mindfulness. And to the extent that, I mean, I know you'd mentioned and made allusions to the idea of mindfulness being instrumentalized and being sort of used in cynical ways. That in that context, I really love the idea that, you can't just have one little positive social interaction and, oh, look, I've made that person mindful. Right. No, it really does have to be something that's a contextual effect, is that, gosh, mindfulness really blossoms when you're around people that you trust, that you like, that you have positive interactions with, and you can't really get it in a cheap sort of one-off way through just one-off interactions. So I think kind of, in addition to more of the causality sort of scientific debate, the practical implications are neat there too, which is that at least for these social antecedents, it really does seem to be, based on at least these two studies that we've run, a contextually driven phenomenon, which is kind of nice and kind of positive. And I think it has some pretty good humanistic implications.
Very nice. Thank you. And I'd like to ask each of you, maybe Chris, we can start with you, a question about in the research and this work that you've been doing. And it might be something directly in these studies. Maybe it's something you've run across that isn't explicitly in here. But what is it that you personally have found really interesting or maybe inspirational to you in your own practice that you've run across in this work?
It's a good question. I'll take a second to think about that. I think I'll probably steal the one that Ravi is going to go for, so he'll have to pick another one. But the idea that our mind is so powerful, right? I think we know that, but this idea that what we believe about the mind absolutely has an impact on what actually becomes the reality in our mind, I think is just really, really neat. And, it's sort of a more nuanced way of thinking about the common phrases that we've heard probably since being a kid, this idea that, believe it and make it happen and you can do it. And in so many ways, as you explore the depths of your mind and recognize that your capacity to self-regulate and manage your attention is inherent in a lot of ways to you in the practice, right? I think it's very, very empowering. Just like in the leadership realm, the analog would be to, I always tell leaders, like, how could you possibly hope to lead others well if you can't lead yourself well? And I think at a very basic level, leading ourselves well entails absolutely understanding how our mind works and how it doesn't work when we want it to sometimes. And so much of that has to do with how we allocate our attention. And I challenge folks when leading workshops and training in mindfulness and in leadership is to ask the question often, is who and what is getting your attention throughout the day, and do they deserve it? And I think that often shakes people to the core, because they recognize that what they're spending so much time thinking about and being anxious about is all about future things they want to have happen and past things they wish they had happen. And it's not about being in the moment at all, which is, of course, the only moment we can actually control. And I think once they feel that and see that, the power of mindfulness is unlocked for them in a way that they haven't thought of mindfulness before. So I think that's what I would say. And then probably to steal something else, because Ravi just said it. I think this idea that it can't be faked as much. I mean, we've seen this across 2 of our studies now, and from a leadership perspective, it's not like you can just tell someone to be nice. It's that leaders have a requirement to create organizational cultures where people are trusting and where people care about each other and value each other. So it's creating the very structure in which people exist in the organization that creates this kindness and this vulnerability and this connection. And leaders are very much responsible for doing that. So I think those would be my 2 things.
Ravi, how about for you? What are the morsels you're going to dig out now that Chris stole those 2?
I know. I don't know. There are just some ideas that I like to pretend this is all a very rational process, but I think a lot of what motivates at least me, and I know Chris and maybe other people who are doing research, is just beautiful ideas. And all right, you wrestle enough with a beautiful idea and you might come up with something that's true or helpful or whatnot. But just this idea of becoming, I just think it's incredibly profound. Almost everything about, how we talk about the world, how we think about things, it makes the world out to be these stable entities. And it really makes us see things in rigid terms. And so, no, everything's always in a process of becoming. Change is an inherent part of everything. I mean, it's like that, that example of like the ship of Theseus. It's like the ship is constantly being replaced one part at a time. And, we keep calling it the same ship, but eventually all of the parts are different than when it started out. And so we do think about things as these stable entities, and that kind of blocks the way that change is always an inherent part of existence and reality. And so, on one level, I think this applies to, process philosophy and philosophy of science. On another level, that's probably a great way to sum up the ideas of anitya and impermanence in Buddhism, and the importance of, for example, not reifying things. And in Buddhism, again, there's this whole idea of pratitya samutpada, which is how subjects and objects appear to exist independently, but they actually kind of co-arise based off of, underlying consciousnesses, like the storehouse conscious. So there's all these sort of aspects that kind of play into becoming, from the, the philosophic aspects to the Buddhist elements to the methodological, and then there's also the practical, which is that, again, if we don't think about mindfulness as something that just people have, but we think about it as something that's constantly emerging and arising in the ways that, some more stable elements, but also more fluctuating situational elements seem to all function together, well, gosh, that opens up a whole new arena and way of thinking about how we can design systems to encourage mindfulness. And again, kind of, I guess, going full circle-ish, is I think that's kind of the neat aspect or the neat charge that people who are thinking about organizations and organizing have to think about, which is it's not just about taking mindful people and putting them into a organization and calling that organization a mindful organization. It's about how do you interweave these facilitating aspects that are encouraging of mindfulness, that are helping people engage in these metacognitive beliefs, that are helping draw their resources towards the things that they need to do. How do you build that into the very fabric of organizing? And in that sense, I mean, I don't know how far we can take it, right? I don't know how far this idea of designing systems for mindfulness could go, but one thing that I've been exploring lately and had a chance to interact with people around is in the field of high reliability organizations. So I was just at a conference with these nuclear regulators and nuclear operators. And so for them, I mean, constantly they're thinking about mindfulness and how is it that you can ensure that people are attending to what's going on, that they're being flexible in how they're interpreting, this information that they're paying attention to. And it can't just be something that we relegate to the individual to do. It's got to be something that we're thinking about is how to design situations and systems. So kind of at least what's been inspiring to me is really taking this paper as an opportunity to think through an ontology of becoming and what that means for mindfulness, and then how might we apply it to some of the major real pressing social issues in terms of, again, systems that we depend on for critical infrastructure, for safety, for survival, for energy, that we really don't want to break down. How can we help facilitate mindfulness, again, not just by putting the burden on individuals, but by designing systems to facilitate that? And so I'm inspired by the beauty of the idea of becoming, and I'm really kind of motivated to really drive home the practical aspects of how we can utilize that idea into something that's going to make us better off socially.
Thank you very much for that. So for those who are listening to this episode, I'll have some links on the episode page. And I want to thank our guests today, Chris, Reina. Chris, thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us.
And Ravi Kudesia. Ravi, thank you so much for being here as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come and visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.